And still with us in studio, we have our defense correspondent, Jonathan Regev, our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran, and joining us in studio is Douglas Murray. He's a prominent British author and commentator. He's been outspoken on a number of subjects, sometimes controversially so. One of those issues has been the influx of Muslim immigration into European nations, which he charges is helping undermine the democratic values of Western societies. He's also been outspoken in his defense of Israel, especially in the current conflict, effectively making the case for its battle against Hamas in the media, and he's now here even doing some field reporting from down on the Gaza border. Douglas, before we speak, I just want to note, today is the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, the Nazi pogrom aimed at the Jews of Germany and Austria. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, spoke in Berlin today at a memorial ceremony, and he had this to say.
waren vielleicht dabei, als Edi Fachler.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jews have been marginalized for centuries, still and again, even here in our democratic Germany, even after the violation of civilization committed by Germans during the Shoah. It is a disgrace. It outrages and shames me deeply. Any form of anti-Semitism poisons our society, as Islamist demonstrations and rallies are doing now. We do not tolerate anti-Semitism, nowhere.
Douglas, we'll get to what you've seen here and be doing in Israel in a minute. But I just ran that clip because it was striking that Chancellor Scholz mentioned the Islamist rallies being seen in Germany and linking that with anti-Semitism, even with the Nazi period. I said before, outspoken about, as you see, the influx of or the impact of the Muslim immigration, eroding of some democratic values. You've taken some heat from that, certainly. So I want to get your reaction to what we've been seeing there in the streets of Germany, in the streets of the UK, from with these rallies, which are not just pro-Palestinian, but in many cases pro-Hamas.
Well, you say I've been outspoken. I haven't been outspoken. I've just said what everyone can see with their eyes.
But not everybody has spoken out about, so that's why I say outspoken.
But it's not controversial. What I've said for years has been that if you import people from different places in the world, you also import the problems from those places. If there was a war tomorrow between India and Pakistan, it would break out on the streets of Britain as well, because we have very large populations from both peoples. It's inevitable that if you allow very large influx from the Muslim world into Europe, into Britain, that has consequences, as we see in America. Much small immigration to America, but it has a very palpable effect. You know, you've got to remember that in Europe, far-right anti-Semitism of the kind that we saw in the middle of the last century is so toxic, it is so pushed to the margins. There are still some scummy people who play around with these dark things, but they're nowhere near the center of power anywhere in Europe and haven't been for 80 years. There are some people on the far left of politics who do play around with the same dark things, particularly anti-Semitism, and they come a little closer to the center. Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who laid a wreath, remember, at the grave, or said he was present at the laying of the wreath of a grave to the people who carried out the Munich Olympics massacre. He got a bit too close to power, but effectively the British public said, we don't like this stuff. We don't want this noxious anti-Semitism. But there is a bit of it from the far left in Europe. But the main driver, the people who were marching down the streets in the center of Berlin the other day, they're recent arrivals in Germany. And what we're hearing now from Scholz, from other prominent German politicians, is, I think, an overdue acknowledgement of the fact that because Germany, since the last war, decided it had to show itself to be a bastion of liberal values and decided those liberal values included liberal immigration values, a country that did not need more anti-Semites has imported millions more anti-Semites. Now that is going to be a very big problem in the years ahead, principally for Germany, as it is in my country, in Britain. It is very noticeable that it is the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, and the head of Labour in North Scotland, Anna Sarwar, who were the first people in the Labour Party to call for the ceasefire and break the party's rules on this. Why? Because, like much of the Muslim world, they don't care about their fellow Muslims. I'm convinced of this and can argue it all evening. They don't care when hundreds of thousands of Muslims are killed in Yemen. They don't care when hundreds of thousands of Muslims are killed in Syria. There has been not 1% of the people on the streets of Europe in recent weeks who marched in those days. They don't really care. What they do care about is when a conflict involves anyone from the Muslim world and the Jews. The simple rage, and I have worked for years with moderate Muslims, with liberal Muslims, with Muslims who try to evolve on all sorts of issues with their religion. The one thing that it is hardest to get even the most liberal Muslims over is the right of Israel to exist, to self-determine, to defend itself. And we see the results, which are hundreds of thousands of people across Europe marching against the Jewish state. And by the way, I mean, I live in New York much of the time. It's the same there. The day after the massacre on October the 7th, I went down to Times Square. There was an anti-Israel protest. How do I know it's anti-Israel and not just pro-peace? Well, the people waving placards glorifying what had happened 24 hours ago was one giveaway, as it was that they didn't even allow Israel to mourn the dead. They hadn't even found the dead before these people turned out. I think it's a deep shame for a country like mine. We should feel intense shame that it's on the streets of London that people are calling for jihad and intifada. We had a taste of intifada, by the way, ourselves on our London Underground. It's intense shame of the Australians that it should be Muslim migrants into Australia that stand outside the Sydney Opera House and chant "Gas the Jews." This, I always say, Israel has, as everyone in this room knows and everyone watching knows, many problems of your own, political problems, all sorts of issues. You can deal with those problems. They're your problems. But this is our problem.
Right. Well, let's talk about that now in the context of Israel's current battle against Hamas. As you said, even those people who say that they're friends of Israel are pressuring Israel for a ceasefire. We hear again the accusations that the response is disproportionate, even among people who are Israel's closest allies.
Yes, well, I mean, I would say Israel is the one country in the world never allowed to win a war. You always have to, at best, have a draw. It's like Israel can be attacked, and Israel is allowed to attack a little bit in order to return to the moment just before the attack. That doesn't seem fair to me, nor does it seem to me to be consistent with the rules of war historically. Wars finish when someone wins and someone loses, and the victor knows they've won and the person who loses knows they've lost. The international community, it seems to me, including my own government in Great Britain, never allows this to happen. And don't forget, I mean, this is...
So it has been somewhat more supportive of Israel this time, you have to say.
It is supportive. As I always say, we have a Democrat president in the United States and a Conservative Prime Minister in the UK who have been very supportive. It's true that at the penthouse level in politics abroad, it's okay. The foundations, however, are rotten. Are rotten. You go 2 generations below Joe Biden in the Democrat Party, you do not have the intense pro-Israel feelings that Joe Biden has.
Well, it's a mix. I would say there are some politicians, and
by the way, it's in the Republican Party. I'm not making a political
I understand.
point.
There are some exceptions, and Richie Torres is a congressman from New York, for example.
Yeah.
There are exceptions. Let's talk about what you're doing here. What brought you to come here to Israel, and what you've seen on the ground here?
I always come to Israel during wars, partly because I like to see with my own eyes always what I'm writing about. I do that with any war I'm writing about. I was in the Ukraine last year, reporting from the front lines of that conflict. I thought it was very important to be here and see what was happening with my own eyes. I was in one of the kibbutz you mentioned earlier yesterday, seeing the remains of that community. And I still think that the international community hasn't really allowed Israel time to even grieve what happened. It's extraordinary to me how I spend my life in news and media, but it's extraordinary to me how this story got knocked down the news agenda within 24 hours maybe. And I think it's important, over to my New York Post column tomorrow from Near Oz. I think it's very important the world knows more about this. I think many people don't realize this was like a battalion-sized terrorist deployment into Israel. And I think the stories need to be told, and told far more even than they have been so far. And I suppose the second thing is I want to see what's happening on the ground. That's why I was at the Gaza border and doing more in the days and the weeks ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you could stay with us, Douglas, because you mentioned that October 7th, of course, attack, or even beyond that, you might say. There is some interesting development relating to that today. A bombshell investigation by the NGO Honest Reporting suggested that photojournalists in the Gaza Strip may have known in advance about the October 7th massacre, and that's creating a storm in Israel and beyond. A senior correspondent, Owen Alterman, reports on how the episode is raising questions about the roles of some journalists in the conflict, while, of course, sparking anger across Israel.
Pictures of the October 7th massacre, not only from Hamas perpetrators, not only from Israeli survivors, but also here from photojournalists entering Israel from Gaza, the subject of a report out Wednesday from the pro-Israel watchdog group Honest Reporting.
What were they doing there so early on what would ordinarily have been a quiet Saturday morning? Was it coordinated with Hamas? Did the respectable wire services, which published their photos, approve of their presence inside enemy territory, together with the terrorist infiltrators?
The central questions are about the role of a journalist. At what point is a journalist too cozy with a terrorist organization? And at what point must a journalist step out and prevent a war crime? At the expense of that journalist's core role, documenting events and explaining reality.
They were there. They witnessed terrorist attacks, these people. And instead of trying to stop these terrorist attacks, they photographed them to the world. They did things that were unethical.
One photographer, a freelancer working with AP, seems to have relished the attack. And here is seen smiling with Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza.
If there were journalists who knew about the massacre, who stayed quiet and filmed while children were being massacred, they are no different from the terrorists and will share the same fate.
There, senior Israeli leader Benny Gantz drawing his conclusion Thursday, with a unit of the Israeli Prime Minister's office calling the photographers, quote, partners in crimes against humanity, and asking media outlets for clarification, as Israelis focus their anger at those they see as Hamas's helpers.
And there has been some reaction from some of these media outlets since that report was prepared. AP, the New York Times are saying none of their staff members had any advanced knowledge of the attacks, and they deny that any of their regular journalists crossed over in the border into Israel. At least the New York Times does, though there was one, CNN, I believe, did say it would no longer work with one of those reporters. Of course, Douglas, this raises some questions about the role in the media, and anyone who has looked on YouTube and seen you in the last over the last few weeks has seen you in some very combative interviews with the media, and this conflict in particular, I think, because of, again, as you said, the ferocity of the atrocities committed by Hamas would have certainly made Israelis feel this was something different, and yet for some the narrative of the media went back to a very familiar tone fairly soon.
Oh yeah, it's always familiar. I mean, everybody knows how familiar it is who watches this conflict. The normal thing is for entities like, for instance, the BBC, CNN, New York Times, is anything that comes out from the Israeli authorities is treated with intense skepticism. Saying things like, according to Israeli government sources, which is a sort of warning sign. It's a scare quote. And yet, as we know, for instance, with the hospital car park bombing the other week, they will quote not just Hamas's account of something, they'll quote Hamas's figures on something. The thing that people didn't pick up as much as the original error there was the fact that nobody could explain where the figure 500 came from.
Right.
The only explanation was that somebody in Hamas made it up, handed it to the media, and then the media ran with it. Well, this is the same media, by the way, that is constantly telling us that we have to fact check and that they are the fact checkers. The BBC even has a reporter whose full-time job is meant to be to discover disinformation within the world media and enlighten us. Well, she should walk to the studio next door and she'd hear it going on all the time. This is a big problem for the media, but it's a consistent one. They consistently believe the terrorists. And there's of course, and some people watching will know this, there's a structural problem within journalism in the West, which is, in a place like Gaza, it is very hard to find somebody who is an honest reporter. It's the nature of it. I've known enough Palestinian journalists in my time, as everyone here has, who have not been able to operate in the areas they used to operate in because they've said one critical thing about one Palestinian figure who's in charge, and that's it for them. So inevitably, everyone is compromised. Everyone is compromised who's reporting from a zone like Gaza, and the media believes it needs the sources, and instead of putting the scare quotes around the Hamas sources, they put the scare quotes around the Israeli government sources. And this has been, the good news about this is that in this conflict, in my view, the response to this is far, far better advanced than it has been in any other conflict. There is now a whole ecosystem of organizations, people like Honest Reporting, you cited there, of actual fact checkers in the media, groups, organizations, individuals around the world who actually do chase this stuff up now and bring it to huge notice. And we have the advantage of this being able to go around the traditional media sources and go straight to the public through social media. So there's a battle on in the social media as in the real world. But I think actually that a lot of the truth is coming out in this conflict. A lot more of the truth is coming out in this conflict than any conflict in this region I've covered in the last 20 years.
All right, Douglas Murray, you're one of those people here now reporting. Thank you for coming to Israel at this time of conflict, and thank you for joining us on I-24 News.
Great pleasure. Thank you.